The next big objective for the class that's going to give you points, and this is actually going to give you a double block of points, two different activities worth 100 points each, so 200 points total. They combine, as you know, in your syllabus for a percentage of the grade, so the two of them averaged together will be weighted appropriately towards your final grade. But this particular objective is the next logical step in the process of hiring somebody, and it is the development of the series of questions that you're going to ask them during your interview and the tool that you're going to use to evaluate them as they do that. And I'm going to try to talk your way through both of those things fairly quickly so that you kind of know what I'm looking for. You kind of give an idea of what ought to make you successful in the process. And ultimately, this doesn't have a big impact on your overall grade. It might, it's the difference between a letter grade perhaps if you do horribly, but it's 10 or 20%, I forget right offhand what it is. The big piece of your grade is the interview. If you do the job description well, or you did do the job description well, and if you do the questions very well and the hiring matrix very well, you're positioned extremely well to do good interviews that'll lead to a good hiring decision, and that's what gives you the biggest bang for this particular class in terms of your overall grade. So we need to really focus on what we want to ask them and what we want that experience to be like in the interviewing process. The better you have narrowed down your questions to the things that you need to know to value or evaluate what they bring to the job potentially, the better you're going to be able to really distinguish from one candidate to the next. You know by now that you've got a number of applicants, either 5 or 6 probably, depending on how folks from the business communications team have lined up for your jobs. And you need to be able to recognize very subtle differences in some cases between applicants. Now, over the course of your 6 interviewees, there'll be maybe 1 or 2 of them that just are clearly not fit for this job. They're not ready for the real world, and you can discard them right away. But you may have 3 or 4 that are fairly close. Perhaps one really stands out head and shoulders above everybody else, and your decision's pretty easy. But there might be 2 or 3 perhaps who are fairly close, and you need to be able to distinguish little bitty things to make the difference in making your decision. And that's where the quality of your questions comes in, and the quality of your scoring tool comes in. It makes it a whole lot easier to evaluate and distinguish the various applicants if they've had the same questions. And it's not unfair when we talk about the procedural fairness. If everybody has the same questions, it's reasonably fair. It's not up to you to make a good decision on who's hired and who's not. It's up to them to make sure that they don't do poorly compared to everybody else on the very same standard. So we want you to come up with a list of questions. Now, how many questions you have is going to be up to you and your teammate or teammates. I would suggest that if you are using the pattern of the interviewing that I talk about in the interviewing A or interviewing number 1 video, that you're trying to fill up a good 20 to 25 minutes. And if you assume that on the average they're going to spend about 2 minutes answering a question, then you probably need to have 12 or 13 questions. But as you develop those questions, you're probably going to have a feel as you interact with your partner there, which questions they're going to talk a little bit longer about and which questions they're going to talk a little bit less about. It's very similar in nature to developing a PowerPoint for a class. As you put the PowerPoints together, you got a sense of which ones you're going to talk longer on. So you might allocate 5 or 10 minutes on those, and other slides only 1 minute apiece. And you build your slideshow based upon the time that you have and how much time you think you're going to spend on each slide. Same thing with these questions. Some of them, it's not going to take but 3 seconds or 10 seconds to answer this, but another question, they're going to have to think about it a little bit, and they're going to have to give you some background perhaps, and they're going to have to talk about it and evaluate it, and it may take several minutes, so you decide what's the right number of questions to ask. Once you've kind of gotten an idea of how many questions you want to ask, now you've really got to determine what it is that we want to know. And probably the best way to do it is to go and look at your job description and the specific things that they're going to have to do and the skills that you think they need, and try to come up with questions that will help you to determine whether they can do those things and whether they have those skills and that knowledge. So from a big picture perspective, we're looking at two different things here. We're looking at the question set for one Dropbox, and we're looking at the hiring matrix for another Dropbox. In each one of those separate Dropboxes, like I did with the job description, I gave you, in this case, two examples of pretty good tools that the team in the past has used. And both of them have their strengths. One of them is really detailed in terms of the structure and the logic of it. The other one is detailed in terms of how I'm going to evaluate this thing and what the range is that we are going to allow the raters to use. But you want to develop written questions that each one of you can have on the table in front of you as you're doing the interview, maybe even detailed to the point that you've marked in the name of who's going to ask it and whatnot. But you probably want to have not only the text of the question that you want to ask, but perhaps why you're asking it. As we know from discrimination conversations and things like that, everything that you do has to have a purpose. Every question you ask has got to have a reason behind it. With this question, I'm trying to find out this. With this question, I'm trying to evaluate or measure that. So think about what your objectives are and work into the questions based upon what you have to know. Now, you've been on probably several interviews in your life, and you know what the standard stock questions are. Tell me about one of your strengths. Tell me about your biggest weakness. Well, if that doesn't really tie into what you're trying to do, it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of their time. And you've got a limited amount of time. You're not trying to kill time. You're trying. That's two completely different approaches to interviewing. And one approach is, I've got this block of time and I got to fill it somehow, so I'll ask whatever I have to ask to make it last as long as it needs to last. The other approach is, gosh, there is so much information that I need to get and I've got a limited amount of time to do it. What are the most important questions to ask to be able to decide, yes, you're qualified and you're going to be a good fit, or no, you're not? So think about what you want to find out and develop a series of questions that lead you to the answers that you need to know to be able to make a decision. Now, some of them, it's going to be a variety of the questions, the types that we've talked about. There's going to be some very short answer type questions, very closed type questions. And it's simply, this is a blank on your resume, fill in the blank for me. What did you do during this time period? Or what did you do in just a sentence or two at this particular job, or something like that. It may be an open-ended question where you talk about, it's going to take a minute or two to answer, but it is historical based. You may have some behavioral type questions where you ask them to describe something that really happened in the past. Or it may be a situational type question where you say, I realize that based upon where you are in life, you probably haven't had to do this yet, but hypothetically, if you were in this position, tell me how you would respond. So it's not something you can really draw from, I remember a time when I got mad or whatever, but you know what, if I were in a situation where the boss was screaming at me, here's what I would do. A variety of those kinds of things. And you may even, in the process of designing the question, kind of think about with your partner, what do we think is a reasonable answer for this? But develop a list of questions. You want to be able to submit to me in the Dropbox a Word document that lists all of the questions and what are the pertinent information you think I need to have to be able to determine whether, as an HR consultant, you're on track to be able to do this right. The grading for this on 100 points looks at four things. Number one, the quality of the questions that you asked. And it's scaled just like the other things that we've done on a perfect, an A, a B, and a C. So in this case, it's 50, it's 45, it's 40, or it's 35. And I'm looking at how good is the quality of these things. Is it outstanding? Is it pretty darn good? Is it pretty average? Or is it lacking in some way in terms of the way that you phrase the questions and what you're really getting at? The second piece of it is worth 30 points, and that is the completeness. If I'm looking at this job description, are you asking questions that really tie together everything, that tell you what you need to know about the candidacy and whether it's a good one or not? Or are you missing something that's kind of important? If I were to read over the questions after reading over the job description, is there anything that jumps out at me in this resume that's not being addressed as it ties to the job description that you should have asked a question for, but you didn't for some reason? That affects the completeness. So it's, again, on a perfect ABC kind of thing, it's 30, 27, 24, 21. 10 points each for applicability and cleanliness. Applicability is different from completeness. Completeness means that you've asked everything that's important. Applicability means, as I look at these questions, do they tie back to the job description? Have you asked anything that's just kind of out there, that's kind of random? And we just talked about how you got a limited amount of time. You got to make sure that everything has a purpose, everything has a reason, everything ties directly one-to-one with something that's important for success on the job. So do the questions that you ask apply to the job that you're trying to hire for? And then the last piece is the cleanliness. Is the structure of the thing done well? Are they phrased well? If I were listening to them rather than reading them, would I know what you're asking me? Would I be able to answer it? So 100 points on all of that. That's the questions. Give me a Word document. Each one of you probably will submit the exact same thing, but I want a document from each one of you. And if, hey, here's a circumstance where you and your partner may disagree on what question we need to ask. If y'all disagree, you give me what you think we ought to ask. So yours could be different because I disagree that we need to ask this question, and I can't get this person to understand why I think that this is wrong. So maybe give me different questions if you don't agree on what the question set should be. But a document, Word document, that has all your questions listed, and I'll give you feedback. Just like we did with the job description here, I want to be able to give you feedback in plenty of time for you to revise those questions. If I say, I think I would not ask this one, or I would rephrase this one, or what are you trying to get here, to where you can clean up your question set before you have to do the interviews. The second piece of this in the other Dropbox is the hiring matrix. And in my mind, I envision really something that's created in Excel, where you have a column with something that you're measuring, and then there is an area where you can put a 5 or a 3 or a 1 or whatever, or a 10 or a 7. You don't want to have a scale that's too big. So it may be either a plus, a neutral, or a minus. But when you're thinking about 6 different candidates, you might need a little bit more distinction between a plus and a neutral. You might want a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, so that there are some 4s and not just 5s and 3s, which would be the equivalent of the 2s and the 1s and the 0s or whatnot. But you want to, in your hiring matrix, certainly a big piece of it is how well do they answer each question, and every question has an impact. You're asking a question for a very specific reason. So you probably don't want to have a section that says, overall, how did they do with questions? You want to be able to evaluate every question individually, specifically. So every question probably has its own line in that matrix. And that allows one person to do really well on one question and not so well on the next question, and still do well overall. Maybe you even have different scoring systems depending on how important the question is. A question that's kind of a yes, no, or a very short answer may not be as valuable to you as something that says, tell me about a time when you had to show leadership skills. So a yes, no question, where did you get your degree, or tell me about one particular class in your degree that was important, might only be worth 3 points. But tell me about a time when you had to take the leadership on a team and how it worked out, maybe worth 10 points. You decide how the scoring goes. So every question probably identified somehow, but there's a lot of other things. You probably have a section in your hiring matrix where you evaluate their resume. Is it complete? Does it tell me what I need to know? Is it clean? Those kinds of things. Do they turn it in on time? What about their cover letter? Is it logical? Does it flow? Does it tell me something that's valuable? That can distinguish a candidate. And you probably know as well as I do that if you've got 2 candidates who are pretty well qualified equally, one of them has a very clean, concise resume and the other one is just full of errors and whatnot, the one that's clean and concise probably gets the job over the one that's not. And sometimes even when they do well in an interview, they may get knocked out of contention because they didn't do a very good job of presenting themselves in the resume. So that may be a piece of it. There's other intangibles. How confident do they seem? How well do they express themselves? How well do they communicate? Were they dressed professionally? Were they here on time? There's some really, really good examples in those two hiring matrix samples that I gave you. You certainly don't want to just take one and give it back to me. You want to customize it for your job, because there may be things that are important to you that weren't important to them, or there may be things that are really not important to you that they thought were pretty critical. But there's some good ideas, and you probably want to take those and build on those to design your spreadsheet. All I really want you to do is you may want to attach an Excel file to that Dropbox, or you may want to attach a Word document, depending on how you've designed it. But you want to be able to not only tell me what you're going to measure, but how you're going to measure it, and then kind of define for me how you're going to use all that information to create ideally some sort of a point value or a number that you could very quickly say, this person had 82 points and this one had 79 points, so the 82 gets it. One more thing to consider in your hiring matrix is that this person may do very well in terms of a resume and very well in terms of presentation and answer questions, but there's something that just gnaws at you that you can't explain, that you don't feel good about. And you may have a section on that hiring matrix that's just your gut feeling, and they may do well on things, but your gut feeling says something's wrong, and that gives you the flexibility of knocking down a few points, or maybe elevating somebody who didn't do so well, but you just got a feeling that they're probably right, even though they didn't present well. You decide. I'm not telling you what has to be there, but there's some examples of what might be there. Same kind of scoring, 50 points towards the quality of the document that you create, 30 points towards how complete it is in terms of giving you all the information that you need to know to make a decision, 10 points in terms of whether the individual pieces of it are applicable to what you're trying to do, that there is a scoring mechanism that applies to something in your questions, that applies to something in the job description, and then 10 points for how clean is it, how easy is it to follow, does it flow through, would you get lost in the process of doing it. Submit a Dropbox for each one of those things, the questions and the hiring matrix, a separate Dropbox with an attachment from each person in your group, even if it's the same thing. And then I'll give you some feedback on the hiring matrix, again, with the idea that you could take that hiring matrix feedback, you could make some adjustments to the form itself, and then you'd have it ready. And then my recommendation is that when you do your interviews, let's say you've got 6 interviews, that you've printed 6 question sheets and 6 hiring matrix sheets, and that when person A comes up, you've got one of each sitting right there, and you're making some notes on the question sheet based upon their answers, and you're making some little jot marks and tick marks and circling some numbers on the hiring matrix, so that when you're done, you're able to very quickly score up this particular candidate and give a final rating on how they're doing. If you have questions about what I'm looking for, or you don't see the value of this, shoot me an email and let me talk to you a little bit more about it. This is not the way that everybody does it. Most folks have some sort of a question set. There are some that just kind of wing it off the top of our head. I would argue with you that they're less successful in getting great employees. Not everybody has a hiring matrix, but I think that using something like this that's well designed, that ties directly to what you're trying to do, makes it so much easier to validate which one you think is higher than the other. And if you and your partner disagree on who is the strongest, then you've got the documentation to be able to compare and come to a conclusion on what it is. At any rate, hopefully this video tells you a little bit more about what I'm looking for, and it gives you a little bit more confidence in terms of being able to perform at a high level.